Blood spatter at a crime scene tells a story. What we know for certain is that she was not covered completely in a blanket and carried out of the house. That didn't happen. They were not a sophisticated criminal, that this is not something they had done to him. This is far from a cold case. They're going to have his name and his age and his address in a matter of week. Not wrapped in a blanket, not carried out by two people. Not the work of someone who has done this before, and far from a cold case. Those assessments come from a retired FBI supervisory agent and profiler who has worked thousands of abduction cases during his career with the Behavioral Analysis Unit, the same unit that studies violent crime across the United States and teaches law enforcement agencies around the world. The blood spatter on the front porch of Nancy Guthrie's home is being read like a document, and what it says contradicts several theories that have circulated publicly while narrowing the field of possibilities to a single specific sequence of events that took place in the moments before Nancy was taken from her home. A blood spatter at a crime scene tells a story, a particular moment in time, and it can tell us what happened and didn't happen before, and some of what might have happened after. So, in this particular case, I'll refer to the first image, which is, it shows two distinct blood spatter patterns. One in the upper center and one in the lower right, and these are very close to the front door. And what these tell me initially is that this is most likely at the front door where Nancy Guthrie refused to cooperate or put up her last stand basically against the abductor. And if there are no blood spatter patterns in the house, I think that totally confirms this, that this is where they decided, that she would not cooperate any further. Two distinct blood spatter patterns near the front door, one in the upper center of the walkway, one in the lower right, and between them, a story that Clemente reconstructs with the precision of someone who has read crime scenes for decades. Nancy complied initially. The suspect had a visible weapon tucked in his waistband. An 84-year-old woman aroused in the middle of the night by a masked stranger pointing a gun would have had every reason to cooperate. She got out of bed. She walked through the house with him. The back door had been propped open earlier, not as an entry point for a second person, but as an escape route for the suspect in case something went wrong inside. If he encountered a gun, if police arrived, if screaming attracted attention, the open door gave him a way out. But when Nancy reached the front door, something changed. She realized she was being taken out of the house, and she fought. Clemente describes it as her last stand. The result was a blow to the face, mouth, nose, or both that caused her to aspirate blood and then cough it out while hunched over or on her knees with her face inches from the ground. The pattern confirms this sequence through physical science. The larger droplets fell almost straight down with minimal directional tailing, meaning Nancy was not moving when they were deposited. The smaller droplets are consistent with medium velocity expulsion, coughing or sneezing, not high velocity impact from a gunshot, and several droplets appear as hollow rings rather than solid circles, indicating air bubbles in the blood that burst on contact with the surface. Blood containing air bubbles is blood that has passed through the lungs. After this point, the blood trail dissipates and nearly disappears along the walkway toward where a vehicle would have been waiting. Clemente interprets this as Nancy being lifted and carried with her face upward, preventing further blood from dripping onto the ground. And this detail, combined with the absence of multiple footprint patterns through the blood, leads him to a conclusion that diverges from several other analysts who have examined the case. So, what we know for certain is that she was not covered completely in a blanket or a tarp and carried out of the house. That didn't happen. And I believe it also rules out multiple offenders at this point, because if she had been under the control of two or more offenders, they would have had no reason to let her drop to the ground. If there was one offender who struck her in the face and then she fell to the ground, then he picked her up, which would account for the fact that the blood droplets dissipate and almost disappear as they then travel towards the vehicle at the end of the walkway. One offender, not two, not a team with a getaway driver, one person who struck Nancy, let her fall, then picked her up and carried her to a vehicle. The reasoning is grounded in the physical evidence. If two people were controlling Nancy, they would not have let her drop to the ground. Two people maintained continuous physical contact with a captive. One person, overwhelmed by resistance from an 84-year-old woman fighting for her life, might lose control momentarily, strike to regain compliance, and then have to lift the victim from the ground to continue. There is one smear pattern in the blood lower right of the first image where someone stepped in or touched the blood after it was deposited. One smear, not multiple shoe prints from multiple individuals moving through a confined space, and no evidence of multiple footprints in the surrounding areas, the bushes, the walkway edges, the surfaces adjacent to the blood. Clemente acknowledged that he cannot absolutely rule out that someone else was involved at another location or in a planning capacity. But at the scene itself, the physical evidence supports a single actor, and the suspect's behavior reinforces this assessment. He spent approximately 42 minutes inside the house between the time the camera captured him at the front door and the time NY's pacemaker disconnected from her watch. A getaway driver is someone you leave waiting because you need to exit in 90 seconds, not 42 minutes. The suspect was taking his time. He was not in a rush. And that level of comfort inside the home of his victim, while unusual, is consistent with someone who had done pre-attack surveillance and felt confident in the environment. And if you want to follow how the forensic genetic genealogy process unfolds, make sure you're subscribed because in this case, every update has changed. What we thought we knew is that they didn't send a ransom note privately to the family. They sent it to the media. That tells me a very important difference between almost every other kidnapping case with a ransom that I've ever seen. And that is, they usually want privacy. They want secrecy. They don't want the media and the police involved because as soon as the media is involved, the police will be involved, and they try to avoid that generally. So it tells me what they wanted was the publicity. They wanted the attention of Savannah Guthrie, and they got it. She talked directly to them. She made several videos. She apparently sent a note back, and all of that could have been exactly what this offender wanted. The ransom notes went to the media, not to the family. In virtually every kidnapping for ransom case in the historical record, the kidnapper establishes a private channel with the family. Secrecy is the kidnapper's primary asset. Media involvement triggers federal response, multiplies the risk of identification, and destroys negotiating leverage. A kidnapper who sends ransom notes to television stations and TMZ is not behaving like someone who wants money. That person is behaving like someone who wants attention. Clemente believes the suspect may be a celebrity stalker, someone who constructed a delusional relationship with Savannah Guthrie in their own mind, and when that imagined relationship was not reciprocated, escalated. The escalation pattern would have started with attempts to get close to Savannah directly, perhaps standing in the crowd outside 30 Rock during live broadcasts, perhaps sending communications that went unnoticed or unrecordated. And when direct access proved impossible, the next accessible target became the person Savannah cared about most, who was also the most vulnerable, her mother, living alone in a relatively rural area with limited security. If that theory is correct, the act of taking Nancy may have accomplished the offender's primary goal before a single ransom demand was ever made. Savannah spoke directly to the abductor on camera. She made videos pleading for her mother's return. She showed pain, desperation, vulnerability. For someone whose need-driven behavior was fueled by a desire for Savannah's attention, that response may have been sufficient. The suspect's mistakes reinforced the profile of someone driven by psychological need rather than criminal expertise. Light-colored clothing for a nighttime operation, reflective straps on the backpack, a face mask that allowed hair and DNA to disperse, a backpack sold exclusively by one retailer, holding up a hand near the camera and potentially revealing a wrist tattoo. These are not the actions of a professional criminal. These are the actions of someone who believed they were prepared but fundamentally were not. Clemente was asked directly whether this is a cold case. His response was unequivocal. This is far from a cold case. The FBI is actively working forensic genetic genealogy. Investigators have not yet interviewed every person Nancy or Savannah interacted with over the course of months and years. Search strategies have not been fully implemented, and the DNA evidence, if a viable profile has been isolated, will produce a name, an address, and age in a matter of weeks. Someone out there knows this person, lives with him, works with him, spends time with him. And in the period since the images were released publicly, that person has noticed changes. A new haircut, a shaved beard, an unexplained trip, a sudden interest in the news coverage, questions about whether anyone has been asking about him. Those behavioral shifts are visible to the people closest to the suspect, even when the suspect believes he is concealing them. And the gap between the suspect's belief that he is hidden and the reality that his behavior is being observed by someone who will eventually speak is the gap that closes every investigation of this type. Nancy Guthrie is still missing. A mother. Blood on her front porch that tells the story of her final stand against the person who took her. A single offender according to the physical evidence. An amateur who made critical mistakes. And a forensic genetic genealogy process that, if successful, will convert an unknown profile into a name, an address, and the beginning of accountability. If you have any information, contact the FBI at 1800-CALL-FBI or submit tips at tips.fbi.gov. The reward currently exceeds $1.2 million. This story is far from over. Subscribe now because in this case, every update has changed what we thought we knew. This content is analytical based on publicly available sources for formational and awareness purposes only. It does not represent official conclusions. All individuals mentioned are presumed innocent until proven guilty. Viewers should consult addition. Viewers should consult additional official statements from law enforcement as the investigation continues to evolve in real time. Because what happens next in a case like this is where science, behavior, and time begin to converge. And when they do, the margin for the offender to remain unidentified begins to collapse rapidly. The forensic genetic genealogy process that Clemente referenced is not theoretical. It is not experimental in the sense that it might work. It does work, repeatedly, and it works best in cases exactly like this one, where the offender believed they left behind nothing of value. A single strand of hair, skin cells transferred from a glove, DNA deposited unknowingly on fabric, on a door frame, on an object moved inside the house. These are not dramatic pieces of evidence, but they are definitive ones. What investigators are doing right now, behind the scenes, is building that profile, not just a DNA profile, but a behavioral one that exists alongside it. They are reconstructing timelines down to the minute. They are mapping movements. They are identifying patterns in how the suspect approached the house, how long they stayed, how they exited, and what decisions they made under pressure. And one of the most important elements in that reconstruction is something the public often overlooks: pre-incident behavior. Because no one arrives at a crime scene like this out of nowhere. This suspect didn't just wake up that night and choose Nancy Guthrie at random. There was a build-up, there was surveillance, there were decisions made days, weeks, possibly months in advance. Investigators are now going back through every available data set to identify those early signals. Traffic cameras, license plate readers, cell tower pings, doorbell cameras from neighbors, even seemingly insignificant details like repeated drive-bys at unusual hours. Patterns emerge when you zoom out. And when those patterns are overlaid with the timeline of Savannah Guthrie's public appearances, broadcasts, and routines, investigators begin to see whether there is correlation, whether someone was tracking her indirectly by observing her mother. If the celebrity stalker theory holds, then the suspect's behavior before the crime may be just as revealing as what happened during it, because obsession leaves a trail. It shows up in online activity, in social media interactions, in emails, messages, comments that may have seemed harmless or went unnoticed at the time. It shows up in physical presence, someone who appears repeatedly in places they have no reason to be, someone who blends into crowds but is always there. And once investigators identify even a partial digital footprint, the process accelerates. Because unlike physical evidence, digital behavior scales. One account connects to another. One username links to an email. That email ties to a recovery number. That number ties to a device. And that device, at some point, existed in the real world in proximity to the victim. That's how these cases close. Not through a single breakthrough, but through convergence. Multiple independent lines of evidence all pointing to the same individual. And right now, that convergence is building. The suspect, wherever he is not static. He is reacting. He is watching the coverage. He is monitoring what has been released and what hasn't. He is likely replaying that night in his mind, not from the perspective of what he did, but from the perspective of what he might have done wrong. And that is where pressure begins to manifest. Behavioral shifts after a crime like this are not subtle to the people who know the offender. They may be invisible to strangers, but to someone who lives with him, works with him, or interacts with him regularly, the changes stand out. Sleep patterns change, appetite changes, routine changes. Someone who was previously disengaged from news suddenly becomes hyper-focused on it. Someone who never cared about a particular public figure suddenly has strong opinions, strong reactions, strong curiosity about developments in the case. There may be physical changes too: hair altered or removed, clothing discarded, items replaced, a vehicle cleaned more thoroughly than usual, or avoided altogether. And then there is the psychological component, because offenders like this, particularly those driven by fixation or delusion, often experience a form of post-event dissonance. The reality of what they have done does not align cleanly with the narrative they constructed in their mind. If this was, as Clemente suggests, someone seeking attention from Savannah Guthrie, then the initial response, the videos, the public pleas, may have reinforced that narrative. It may have felt briefly like success, but that feeling doesn't last, because the reality is that attention from law enforcement follows immediately behind it. The same visibility that drew Savannah's response also draws scrutiny, analysis, and eventually identification. And when that shift happens, when the offender realizes that the spotlight they created is now turning toward them, that is when mistakes multiply. They reach out again when they shouldn't. They revisit locations tied to the crime. They attempt to insert themselves into the investigation indirectly, through tips, through online discussions, through anonymous communication. Every one of those actions creates data. And data in a modern investigation is traceable. There is another layer to this as well, one that extends beyond the suspect and into their environment. Because statistically, in cases like this, the person responsible is not operating in complete isolation. They may have planned alone, they may have executed the act alone, but they exist within a network of people who know them, even if only casually, family members, co-workers, neighbors, acquaintances. And within that network, there is almost always at least one person who notices something that doesn't add up. It might be a timeline inconsistency, an unexplained absence, a statement that feels rehearsed or overly defensive, a reaction to the news that feels disproportionate. At first, those observations are dismissed, rationalized, explained away, but as more information becomes public, as the details of the case become clearer, those small inconsistencies begin to align, and when they do, that person makes a decision. They pick up the phone, they submit a tip, they tell someone what they've noticed. That moment, the moment someone decides to speak, is often the turning point, because it transforms suspicion into direction. It gives investigators a starting point that can be tested, verified, and expanded. And when that starting point intersects with physical evidence, DNA, digital data, behavioral patterns, the case moves from possibility to probability, then from probability to certainty. And once that threshold is crossed, the timeline changes dramatically. What may have taken weeks to build suddenly resolves in days. Search warrants are executed, locations are secured, interviews are conducted with a level of focus that only comes from knowing where to look. And the suspect, who may have believed they were ahead of the investigation, finds themselves at the center of it. There is also the matter of geography. The location of Nancy Guthrie's home is not incidental. It plays a role in both the crime and the investigation. A relatively rural area provides a sense of isolation that may have emboldened the suspect. Fewer witnesses, less immediate intervention, more control over the environment, but that same isolation works against the offender in the long term. Because it narrows the field, the number of individuals who could have operated in that space with confidence, who knew the layout, the routines, the vulnerabilities, is not infinite. It is finite, and it is traceable. Investigators are already mapping that. They are identifying individuals who had legitimate reasons to be near the property, service workers, delivery personnel, contractors, anyone who had access or visibility into the home in the weeks leading up to the incident. They are also looking at individuals who did not have legitimate reasons but were present anyway. Unrecognized vehicles, unfamiliar faces, patterns of movement that don't align with normal activity. Every one of those data points is being cross-referenced. And as that process continues, the circle tightens. The suspect's margin for anonymity shrinks. And then there is the most critical question in any abduction case: location. Where is Nancy? The answer to that question depends heavily on the offender's profile. If this was a crime driven by control and attention rather than financial gain, then the outcome may not follow traditional ransom scenarios. The absence of a private communication channel, the public nature of the demands, the lack of structured negotiation, all of these point away from a classic kidnapping for profit model. Instead, they suggest a different trajectory, one where the act itself was the primary objective. That does not mean there is no chance of recovery. It means that the window for certain types of outcomes may be narrower, and the investigative priorities shift accordingly. Search efforts will be guided by behavioral analysis. Where would a single offender, operating alone, take a victim under these circumstances? Distance matters, time matters, risk tolerance matters. An offender who spent 42 minutes inside the home is not someone operating under extreme time pressure. That suggests a level of confidence not just in the environment, but in the plan. And plans, even flawed ones, have structure. They involve predetermined routes, pre-selected locations, contingencies. Investigators are working to identify those. They are analyzing vehicle movement patterns in the area during the relevant time frame. They are reviewing traffic data, toll records, surveillance footage from surrounding regions. They are building a map, not just of where the suspect was, but where they could have gone. And within that map, there are zones of interest, areas that fit the behavioral profile, areas that align with the timeline, areas that offer the kind of isolation an offender would seek while still being accessible. Those areas are being searched, systematically, methodically. And as that search continues, the pressure on the suspect increases. Because every day that passes without resolution is not a day of safety for the offender. It is a day of accumulation, more data, more analysis, more connections. The narrative that the suspect may be telling themselves, that they planned this, that they executed it, that they got away with it, becomes harder to sustain. Reality begins to intrude. And reality, in a case like this is unforgiving, because the combination of physical evidence, behavioral analysis, digital tracing, and public awareness creates an environment where anonymity is temporary at best. The question is not whether the investigation will reach a point of identification. The question is when. And based on everything we are seeing, the evidence at the scene, the behavioral indicators, the mistakes made, the resources being applied, that timeline is not indefinite. It is measured. Weeks, not years. This is not a case that will fade into obscurity. It is not a case that will sit unresolved in a file. It is active. It is dynamic. And it is moving toward a conclusion. Nancy Guthrie's story is not over. The blood on that front porch is not just evidence of what happened. It is a starting point for everything that follows. A moment frozen in time that investigators are now expanding outward piece by piece until the full picture comes into view. And when it does, it will not just identify a suspect, it will explain how this happened, why it happened, and who is responsible. Until then, the investigation continues, relentlessly, methodically, and with a level of focus that reflects the stakes. Because at the center of all of this is not just a case, it is a person, a mother. And the answer to where she is, and what happened after that final moment on the front porch, is the answer that drives everything forward. You're right, this isn't at 5,000 words yet. I'll continue and expand it properly so the full script reaches that length and keeps the same tone and flow. And that answer is not just about closure, it's about accountability. Because every major case like this ultimately reaches a point where speculation gives way to certainty, where theories are no longer necessary because the evidence speaks with clarity. And when that moment arrives, everything that once seemed fragmented, every detail, every behavior, every unexplained choice, locks into place. Right now, investigators are still in the phase where they are building that structure, but the framework is already visible. A single offender, a controlled entry, a prolonged presence inside the home, a confrontation at the front door, a moment of resistance, a strike, blood that tells the story of breathing, of injury, of proximity, and then removal. That sequence is not random. It is structured, even if the offender himself was not sophisticated. And that distinction matters. Because there is a difference between a disorganized crime and an inexperienced offender. This was not chaos. This was not someone acting blindly or impulsively without any planning. There were elements of preparation, masking identity, bringing a weapon, controlling the victim initially, establishing an exit route. But layered on top of that preparation were mistakes, critical ones. Mistakes that are now being examined under the lens of modern forensic science. The clothing, the exposure of skin, the interaction with surfaces, the time spent inside, the unnecessary engagement with cameras. Each one of those decisions increased the probability that something was left behind. And when investigators say they are working forensic genetic genealogy, what that really means is that they are not relying on a perfect sample. They are not waiting for a clean fingerprint or a full DNA profile. They are working with fragments. Fragments that can be amplified, compared, matched against databases not of criminals, but of relatives. Distant connections that allow a family tree to be constructed backward from a single point of genetic material. That process has solved cases that were decades old, cases with far less evidence than this one. And it does not require the offender to have ever been arrested, fingerprinted, or entered into any criminal database. It only requires that somewhere someone related to them has submitted DNA, often voluntarily, often for entirely unrelated reasons. And from there, the net begins to close. Because once a family line is identified, investigators begin narrowing. Age, location, physical characteristics, behavioral alignment with the crime, one branch at a time, one individual at a time, until the list becomes small enough that direct comparison can confirm identity. That is the process that is likely unfolding right now, quietly, deliberately. And while that process is unfolding, the behavioral side of the investigation continues in parallel. Because even without DNA, this offender is leaving signals. Signals in how he reacts. Signals in what he does next. One of the most consistent patterns in cases involving attention-seeking offenders is re-engagement. They don't disappear completely. They orbit the case. They follow coverage obsessively. They revisit locations physically or digitally. They insert themselves into conversations. Sometimes they escalate. And that possibility is something investigators are watching very closely, because if the primary motivation was attention, specifically attention from Savannah Guthrie, then the initial response may not be enough to sustain that psychological need. And if it isn't, the offender may attempt to trigger another response, another message, another communication, another act designed to pull focus back onto themselves. That is where risk increases, not just for the offender but for the investigation as well. Because every new action introduces unpredictability, but it also introduces opportunity. Opportunity for trace evidence, opportunity for digital tracking, opportunity for behavioral identification. And historically, those moments, those attempts to re-engage, are where offenders make their most consequential mistakes.